Jedd Fisch's future at Washington has always been cloudy, and we're not getting any answers for a while.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. That's Lars Hanson. He writes with me over at Huskies Wire. Thanks for making this your first watch or first listen today, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKDOWNCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Just a quick reminder to all your videos out there, wherever you get this podcast, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, wherever that might be, make sure to click that subscribe button, click that little bell as well, so you never miss when we post a new show. Plus, if you're on the audio only side of things, please make sure to leave us a 5-star review, as it does help the show out a lot. Now, Lars, we got a really fun show coming at all the everydays out there today. We're going to have another update on the situation with Jacob Manu. Jedd Fisch talked about it a little bit during his Monday press conference, and there are a lot of interesting things to consider on top of that. But we also need to talk about this game against Wisconsin, and Washington's offense has a chance to stay on track, I must say, at this point in time, and really dominate against Wisconsin defense that has struggled this year. But the big thing is our good buddy Christian Capel asked Jedd Fisch today about any potential contract extension, what that discussion might have looked like with Pat Chun and the athletic department. And Jedd Fisch said, we haven't had any kind of talks about that just yet, and we're focused on beating Wisconsin, which I think is a fair diplomatic answer at this point in time.
Yeah, very Bill Belichick answer. We're on the Cincinnati type of thing, where you're looking at it and saying, I mean, what else is Jedd going to say in the middle of a season? Yeah, my agents are having discussions with him. By the way, the agents, that wasn't the question. It's like, hey, have you or your representatives? It was just, hey, what are the contract talks like? Maybe Jedd's agents are doing back channel work, and, Jedd just kind of omits that. I think that's also worthy, kind of keeping in mind here, because if you're Jedd, you don't want to allow any potential outside noise to cloud what comes as a result of Saturday's, game against Wisconsin, where let's say it's somehow, some way, a miracle Wisconsin, keeps it a close game, but UW still wins. And it's like, ooh, was Jedd, worried about his contract situation? Was he considering other things? Like we already saw that in Michigan, where, Florida was firing Billy Napier 3 days before the game even kicked off. So
sure.
When you're a head coach, you basically have to push out all the outside noise. So Jedd gave you're right, diplomatic answer, but there was an interesting kind of undertone there where he kind of just, it was like, yeah, we're not really thinking about that right now. We're just going to get to the end of the season. We'll sort it out then. Jedd, if he finishes 10-2 and then potentially gets a playoff berth, those offers are going to come. Like, that's just the way the situation is.
Well, it's also one of those things where you talk about the potential of getting to 10-2, the potential of getting to the college football playoff. It's not even just offers from other places. It's why would you want to say, okay, yeah, I want to lock this in right now, when if you do go 9-3, you do go 10-2, not just offers from other places, but a potential offer from Washington would also need to continue to increase, which is somewhat of the situation we saw with Kalen DeBoer. And I bring that up because I think that's an important sticking point here, where a few years ago, we were sitting here having this same conversation about Kalen. And, and I just, considering Kalen and his persona and everything like that, when he was sitting there being much more deflective of the answer, saying, oh, why would I want to go somewhere else when my daughter's playing softball here and this is going on and that's going on? And, we weren't reading into the tea leaves of things we didn't necessarily know about behind the scenes, like firing his longtime agent and hiring Jimmy Sexton, things like that went on. Like, there are a lot of other things at play that, we might not be 100% privy to behind the scenes, as much as you and I might hear about one thing or another. And I think that's something that needs to be considered here, because I think that in what is going to be a really odd offseason of coaching hires, where Penn State's open, Auburn is open now, Florida's open, there's potential that other big time jobs could become available. Let's see what happens with Mike Norvell in Florida State. Like, there's just going to be a lot of jobs that are going to be coming available at some point in time, potentially within the next, we're sitting here on November 3rd, month. Like, it's going to be really, really weird. And I think about Jedd, and one of the things that I don't think this is a fair point, but it is realistic. Like, let's say Florida, because that's the name that people are always going to be talking about until they hire somebody. If it's not Jedd, they're going to sit there and say, well, what about Florida? Well, let's talk about that for a second. Do you think that right now, whatever representation he might have is going to be able to go down to the Florida Booster Committee and say, hey, not only is it a $10 million buyout to get him out of his contract before January 8th, 2026, but right now you're selling that guy or they're selling them on a guy who's 29 and 31 overall as head coach. And again, that's not fair because he did a tremendous job turning around a just bare bones program at Arizona with no pockets, nothing like that. And then comes up here to Washington and has them ranked after a year and a half with a program, as I wrote about over on Huskies Wire, that has basically been torn down to the studs following what happened in the national championship. Like, it's not fair, but that is a realistic point that I think is going to be considered by anybody inside or outside of the program with whatever this next move might be. And I must say, I have to go on record and state that I fully believe that Jedd Fisch will be the coach of Washington in 2026.
I mean, I think the odds in favor that Jedd is still back in Seattle next season. However, there's a couple of things to unpack there because Jedd's rep by Wasserman, which has deep ties to UCLA. So when you talk about his representation, there's, that's kind of an interesting foyer there. I think that's more or less why those rumors are floated, but there's no way Jedd goes to UCLA. But so let's talk about the Florida job. If you're Florida, Jedd's probably not your first choice or your second choice or your third choice, because as you mentioned before the show, certainly, but I think on the show a couple of times, Florida wants a guy that has SEC ties. Jedd doesn't have that. He has ACC ties with Miami. He's got Florida ties and things like that with the university. But to say Jedd has a bunch of deep SEC ties is a lie. It's just straight up not true. Could he get around that with his NFL ties and things like that? Maybe. But that's just such a far-fetched to where I still would lean on him being more so in Seattle next season. But at what price? I think that is kind of the crux of all of this. And to get back to your point, if that number right now, let's consider this. Luke Fickell is ranked, I think, 8th in the Big Ten in terms of coaching salaries this season.
Just ahead of him, yeah. He's making like $250K more than him.
Criminal. So I think if you're Jedd and you're Wasserman and Doug Henderson, I believe is his agent, maybe CJ LeBoy, I think is also in that mix as well. You're looking at it and saying, really? Jedd's making $7.757 million. He's not doing he's doing a better job than Luke Fickell. So he should clear 8. We should the 8, 9, where does that number land? That I think is going to be, more so the telling fact and why Jedd will still remain in Seattle, because he has no reason to leave. We've been saying this. He has no reason to go elsewhere to establish what he's already built at Washington. He has the young foundation. He's playing John Mills, the freshman. Yeah, you could say they're doing that and they would do that at any other school. But I think Jedd is truly laying a foundation here to stay for the long haul, at least let's say for the next 3 or 4 years.
So, and that's part of the thing is no matter what, whatever Jedd's future is at Washington, where we don't obviously we can make our predictions, but we can't sit here and speculate and say, oh, it's definitely going to be this, it's definitely going to be that, because that just, it just opens its own can of worms. I feel like the most logical move for him would be to at some point get onto the NFL as a head coach, which is certainly what he wants to do. It just seems very clear. But you talk about playing guys like John Mills and Desmond Roebuck and Dylan Robinson and whoever else. If you are Jedd Fisch, I feel like one of the things that needs to be discussed with this as well is you're probably going to want to take DeMond Williams with you if you do go somewhere else. And again, this is all just speculation, but why would you want to just, maybe go through a whole nother rebuild at a program that the two names that we've said, Florida or UCLA, have both just mightily struggled this year? You've certainly shown that you can turn around a program, but it's going to take a little bit longer than you might like to do that in some cases. And I just feel like there's so much going on here. It's nowhere near just done. It's nowhere near solved. But last thing is, you mentioned just this number with Luke Fickell. I certainly agree. It's something I know we've talked about on some of these previous shows where Brett Bielema is making a little bit over $8 million. If Jedd wants an extension, and Jedd does want to stay in Seattle, takes the increased buyout, whatever that might look like, it's probably going to be somewhere in that range because he does deserve to be paid somewhere in that, let's just call it $8.5 to $9 million a year range with just where salaries are and what he's shown he can do for this program are. So these are just also things to consider as this continues to move along. But those are things we have a lot of time to talk about here on Locked On Huskies. So let's dive into the offense in this upcoming game against Wisconsin. right after a message from our good friends over at FanDuel. The NBA is back, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Even if you missed the start of the game or want to ride the hot hand, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who will score next to fourth quarter comebacks. Plus, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. It keeps every game exciting, especially when your team's making that late push. Right now, FanDuel is giving new customers $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So head to FanDuel.com to sign up and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Lars, as we look at this game against Wisconsin, I want to throw a couple of numbers at you here right off the bat. Wisconsin is number 11 in the Big Ten in total defense at 341 yards per game. They're number 13 in scoring defense at 23.9 points per game allowed, and they're number 14 in pass defense at 230.4 yards or 0.3 yards allowed. Washington, interestingly enough, is number 15 at 230.4 yards allowed. So very close there. But I look at this Wisconsin team and just how they've struggled this year. 2-6 right now under Luke Fickell. And I just feel like Washington's offense has such an advantage, especially getting Quentin Moore back this week is going to be huge because Wisconsin's been solid in terms of their run defense. But I look at what this Husky offense can do, especially when it's right, especially what we saw in this last game against Illinois. And I just have a lot of faith that they can continue to score at a high level, even though they are going on the road and, there's slow start concerns and everything like that.
But I think the Illinois game did show most of those are going away when you have your premium left tackle in Carver Willis back and John Mills being back as well, which Jedd touched on as well during his Monday press conference, saying, yeah, those guys are still good to go. No setbacks there. In addition to Quentin Moore coming back, which I think from a blocking perspective is significant because one thing, Jedd noted that Wisconsin does do pretty well. They got a couple of decent edge rushers. They got some good, push and things like that. So if there is a potential cause for concern, it would be, can you flush him on and can you make him rattle, especially in Cam Brandel? But Cam Brandel is not what Cam Brandel used to be, especially this season. And I just say that with all due respect because it's still a great traditional place to play, but you're 2-6. You're not going to be packing the house like you were at Penn State last season for the whiteout in front of 108,000 people that DeMond got to play in front of in the second half. So I think both that experience last season at Penn State and just having both tackles back with, having Carver back and having Drew as a party really, continuing to take that next step up. DeMond didn't get sacked against Illinois, which again, to be fair, did not boast really any great defense or any defense, to be fair. But it's still something worth noting where you're now stacking that on top of another potentially good week. And I think if you can find just some semblance of a run game, that's really all you need because the offensive attack really goes through DeMond's shoulders.
Absolutely. And that's just such a big part of this too, where you mentioned it's not just Carver Willis, it's John Mills as well. And one thing, quick thing to note is we were, as Jedd Fisch was telling us, expecting Rashid Williams to return for this game. But unfortunately, it sounds like he suffered a hand injury during practice over the bye last week. So he is going to be out for this week and probably a few more. So that's just something to keep an eye on as we continue to just monitor his status over the rest of the regular season. But I just look at this offense and I love all the points that you're making here, but it's also just, it's why I mentioned the passing stats. It's going to come down to what this pass catching core can do because they've shown to be really, really solid all season long. And for a guy like Denzel Boston, who, if whatever NFL draft board you like to read, he continues to move up the ranks. I saw Nate Tice at Yahoo Sports had him as the number 11 prospect in this upcoming draft. Like he's continuing to rise up the ranks. And I think this is something that, just to wrap it in with Jedd Fisch here, he understands that. And we've seen Jedd chase records for guys like Jonah Coleman against UC Davis, where he said, yeah, I understood that the modern school record for rushing touchdowns in a game was 5. And he got Jonah there. Like those are things that we've seen him do. And I think that this is another thing that Jedd is going to be very conscious of because he's already produced one top 10 overall draft pick into Tyrell McMillan. And I feel like he's going to try to do that again with somebody like Denzel Boston, who absolutely has the potential to do so. And this is one of those games where he can build on a 10 catch, 153 yard, 2 total touchdown performance against Illinois a couple of weeks ago with another solid game. And that could be said, it goes back to what we were saying yesterday as well, as the Everydayers know. you are facing a really weak stretch of defenses, starting with Wisconsin, and then Purdue next week, UCLA the week after that. So you can really get a guy like Denzel heating up down the stretch. And that's one of those things that doesn't just play into personal benefit for Denzel down the road, right? As we look at what his NFL draft stock might be, but it's great for this team because, again, this is what we were talking about yesterday. If you're able to get through these next 3 weeks where it can be largely based around the play of your stars, because when those guys show up, especially again against teams you're supposed to beat, it's been somewhat easy sledding, I would say, like, first half of the Rutgers game excluded, but this is, and most of the Maryland game, I omitted that for obvious reasons. But I look at a lot of just how this team has operated when Denzel, Jonah, and Damon have all been on top of their game. And it's been exactly what we'd expect from this offense. They've been really hard to beat and one of the best in the Big Ten. They're 4th in total offense and 5th in scoring.
Yeah, ahead of Ohio State. I think that is, when you talk about looking back at that game and putting everything into perspective, that's how good this team can be when they are clicking on all cylinders. And you look at most of October, you were at 70, 80% max, in terms of just, between left tackle, John Mills going down, Jonah kind of, not being able to get as much footing in the run game and things like that. But that's why I keep going back to the Illinois game. And I know it's not the greatest defense to compare when you look at to be fair,
that's what we're seeing over the next 3 weeks. So I think it's completely fair.
And I'm glad you pointed that out, because it's just, I'm saying in the grand scheme of things, it's worth kind of putting that in the context where it's, again, you're not saying this is Ohio State's defense. You're not saying these are world beaters by any stretch of the imagination, but you should be able to put up 35, 42, even though Jedd said you're not going to have those old Pac-12 scores in the Big Ten because you just don't have those number of possessions. We've seen UW score on 3 out of 4 drives, 4 out of 5 drives and a half. Why not? Now, again, that comes back to Jedd's play calling, Damon executing, which, by the way, he has. I think Damon's held up his share of the bargain. It's just, can Jedd put the right plays in at the right times? And we've seen every now and again Jedd revert back to his old ways of, hey, we're going to go 3 yards in a cloud of dust, and then you end up kind of losing a little bit of momentum there. As long as you don't have that type of situation come up against Wisconsin, there's no reason you're not coming away with a double-digit win and you're covering the 11.5 shutout handle. Yeah, this coming weekend.
So I think that's fair, but one thing to add on to that as well is you talk about just being able to score in bunches, which this offense is, again, proven it's able to do. Wisconsin lost 37-0 to Iowa and 34-0 to Ohio State. I might have those numbers backwards, but they lost a lot to 0 to both of those teams, one of them being Iowa. And I think that this is just one of those things where when we look at what Washington's offense has been all season at its best against inferior defenses, which is where, as we talked about yesterday, there's still a lot of room for this team to improve, especially against the top teams in the country, the Ohio States, the Michigans. But the reality of the situation is you are not seeing one of those teams for the next 3 weeks. So when you look at, and I mean, we've highlighted a lot of these stars because, obviously there are other guys that get involved, as we've seen Desmond Roebuck and his role continue to grow and change. Raiden Vinesbright, Decker DeGraff, having Quentin Moore back, like we mentioned, having all of these guys back in the mix is so helpful for an offense that, again, can be just based around largely like the play of these stars, but having just the second, third, and fourth options like Omari Evans and Chris Lawson are names that we like to bring up in this wide receiver core. And especially now that Rashid Williams is not going to be able to play, I think that Jedd Fisch is going to have to lean on them in a little bit of a heavier capacity. But as you continue to build out what this offense is and can be, and maybe you want to put certain things on film for the Oregon game, whatever else, like adding those guys to the mix is all going to be very, very helpful. And this is one of those games. Again, each of these next 3 games are, but it starts this week, is one of those games where you can really just kind of put things into motion.
You can, and I'm glad you used the word motion. The key there in all of this, let this come to fruition by not shooting yourself in the foot. Do not have the unnecessary penalties, whether it be a holding that you don't necessarily have to do, or the illegal formation that we kind of, see Jedd become susceptible to at times throughout his career, both at Arizona and Washington. Just you look at Wisconsin being such a least, like one of the least penalized teams in the country. I think they're number 7 or number 8 in the country in terms of penalties, fewest allowed, fewest called upon. Washington definitely not in that same realm. So the only way that UW's offense doesn't have a massive explosion is something like that, where it's self-inflicted wounds.
No, absolutely. And absolutely. That's a really big part of it. And I think that it's one of those things where these are things that Jedd still needs to show that he can do on the road. And we saw that early on in the season because we saw the comeback win at Maryland. We saw the big win at Washington State. And then a lot of those things just kind of disappeared in the in the loss at Michigan. So one of the questions around this is like, can you continue to do that at a high level? Because as you continue to search for this consistency, and as you know, to tie it back in with the first segment, as Jedd and his representation certainly want to seek a contract extension or a pay raise in some way, shape, or form, those are some of the little things that really do matter. Because if you can, again, get out of the UCLA game at 9-2, you're just sitting in such a good spot where all of a sudden anything can happen in one game. But it's all about cleaning up all of those little mistakes. And when you can do that with these high-end stars who can cover up a few of those mistakes, but certainly not everything, this is just one of the reasons that this game and this next slate of 2-3 games for the Huskies have become so important, and it's so interesting. But another guy who is going to be really interesting to just see what happens with him next is Jacob Manu. And we'll get there right after a message from our good friends over at Game Time. College football is back, and I couldn't be more excited. The tailgates, the rivalries, the energy in the stands, there's just nothing like it. But let's be real, actually getting tickets can feel like more of a battle than the game itself. Endless queues, hidden fees, prices jumping at checkout. That's why I use Game Time, the app that gives the advantage back to fans. It's the easiest way to score last-minute deals at the best prices with no surprise fees. What you see is what you pay. I pulled up Game Time, and in just a couple of taps, I saw amazing deals. I'm talking about your favorite college football games for as low as $25. The app makes it super simple. You can even see the exact view from your seat before buying. So take the guesswork out of buying college football tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKDOWNCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, that's promo code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Swipe, tap, ticket, go. Download Game Time today. We asked Jedd Fisch about Jacob Manu on Monday, and he said that there might be some kind of ruling coming this week. He said Friday was a target date. And this is one of those interesting things where I've seen some people on social media panicking that this has something to do with Jacob Manu's future at Washington. It has nothing to do with that. This is something where we look at the situation where Jedd hit the nail on the head earlier in the year, saying it's unfortunate that, he got hurt at a certain point in the year. And now we have to go through this when if he had gotten hurt 2 weeks earlier, which is completely unfair, no matter the case, it, wouldn't have been a discussion. I look at this Jacob Manu situation. One of the questions that was asked was, do you judge whether he's going to play or not on the quality of opponent? And he said, no, that it comes down to the health of the other linebackers. And I look at this position, I look at this defense as a whole, really, but at linebacker, the depth is really interesting because Jedd said, yeah, we got, 2 other guys that are in the mix right now, where Anthony Ward has mainly been a special teams guy. And it feels like this coaching staff is just a little bit further away with the other freshmen that they brought in the 25 class in Donovan Robinson and Jonathan Epperson. But I'm curious because I look at Zaydrius Rainy-Sale, and that's a kid who, through his first 3 games, has very clearly gotten better and better and better each week. And he very clearly has a really high ceiling and has the opportunity to be a really productive player throughout his Husky career. But I look at just a 3-man linebacker rotation, and I'm a little nervous in terms of injuries because all of a sudden you can get really thin at that position. But at the same point, I understand why Jedd is taking this approach with Jacob Manu, and I think it's certainly in his best interest to do so.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's something Jedd has been consistent about from the start with Jacob Manu is he's going to do what's best for Jacob and for UW. And I think it's in order of Jacob at the athlete first and then the university, because you look at the depth overall. The only reason you're really in this position, aside from when the injury occurred, is also Buda Alukta being out for the season. Like that really changed the situation a lot, because then you look at it and say, if Buda was still healthy right now, this is a lot easier of a discussion to have, because you can say, you know what, Jacob, we're just going to wait. We got Buda going right now, and I think Buda was playing at such a high level early on in the season that it's no slight to Jacob. I just think they would have said, you know what, we're going to give him 4 games, plus, the bowl game or whatever, however many games they end up playing. That would have been the best plan all along. Now it's just, okay, do we need to play him against, well, you don't need to play him against Purdue. You don't need to play him against UCLA. You don't need to play him against Wisconsin. Only really one game left that you really should play him for, and I think that we both know which game that is. And I think Jedd honestly knows which game that is because he kind of alluded to it during his Monday press conference where he said, hey, we got one game left. We'll figure that one out. And I think there'd be no other reason to kind of wait for that Oregon game just because when you look at Devin Bryant and Alex McLaughlin, the role that Alex plays, I should say, because again, he's a safety, but he plays, coming down to the box and things like that. You have enough pieces against teams that you should beat on already, just kind of going into it with or without Jacob Manu. There's no reason to kind of throw him into the fire when you only have one left.
So I do agree with that. I think that the Oregon game is certainly a big part of this. We're knowing that that is just the best team that you are going to face in this final month with one game to play. I just also think that it's a really fun opportunity to get Zaydrius more work, where you bring up a great point with Buda Alukta, where that is just a very big part of this as well. But with the fact that you can only use him for one more game, you can just start to throw more and more at Zaydrius. And I go back to what Ryan Walter said about him a few weeks ago, as his body allows that. So as we continue to see him get just more snaps under his belt, I was so impressed with what I saw from him against Illinois. I went back and I was watching the film on that, and his pass breakup on the Takario Davis interception was just so impressive, where he's such a fluid mover in coverage. And this is one of the things where this coaching staff has highlighted this since the day he signed, that no matter what position he's playing, he has the ability to, as Ryan Walters likes to put it, create havoc plays. And I'm excited to see what that's going to look like as his career goes along, because I think that he's going to have a really bright future at outside linebacker as a pass rusher, as well as on the inside. And it's just one of those things where right now you can really get his footing under him as an inside linebacker, where I think he's starting to take more pass coverage reps, where I think he's the best coverage linebacker of the three that Washington just has in the rotation as of right now. And I would say that as much as I like Jacob Manu, he's more of a downhill, just stop the run kind of player anyway. So and again, this is something else we talked about yesterday, as we look at these next three games where you have a great opportunity to be in positive game scripts in each of the next 3 weeks. Wouldn't you want one of those guys out there who can be just give you a little bit more in pass coverage at the same point in time? And I think that is, as well as the Oregon thing, right? Just something that is weighing very heavily on this coaching staff in this decision-making process. Hopefully, whatever this comes of this decision, I don't know if it has to do with this lawsuit. Jedd Fisch was very vague on that. If it does end up being a 5-for-5 thing, that is, and he is able to play, like, that's great. But at the same point in time, I think that this could be so beneficial for Zaydrius. And as we've talked about all year, these young building blocks continue to emerge for Washington at every position. We've already seen just the flashes of it with Zaydrius, and seeing more of that and seeing more consistency at that position for the long term is a really exciting thought.
Yeah, almost in a way, it's a stretch here, but work with me here. Damon last season with Will Rogers, where, I'm not saying Jacob and Will Rogers are the exact same level of player, but when you look at, you're going to have with Jacob for next season, no matter what, because this isn't if he plays, this is his last season sort of thing. No matter what, the default's going to be, we'll just hold him out, because that way we'll have him for next season and things like that.
Sure.
Zaydrius, you already know you're going to have for at least the next 2 or 3 years. I'm going to say 2 or 3 for pretty much every player in college football at this point, because there's no reason to say 4. If you want to say 4, great. But with Zaydrius, his ceiling is so high. And I remember, as you were making all those good points, it made me think back to when the entire coaching staff went to Bethel High School, Belichick included, and showed up to see Zaydrius. That was the emphasis, where it's Kafusi, Scotty Graham. I'm not saying Zaydrius is going to play running back, but just the reason you wanted to keep him home was because you knew the building block player he could be. Dylan
Absolutely.
Robinson on the outside, except he was from California. There's those cornerstone pieces of your program, why I compared him to Devon. Because if you can start to unlock him now, then you go into 26 with Jacob and Zaydrius and potentially Buda as a trio again. Like, your linebacker core is already healthier than it was this season. And I think all those signs kind of point to, whatever comes of the lawsuit, like you mentioned. I do think this is a 5-for-5 situation where Jacob, I think he does have a case. And I think, Jedd being a lawyer aficionado.
Oh, there's a very clear case. Yeah.
And I think, but that's Jedd, the lawyer side of him and his family to sort out. But with that, getting the point that I want to make here is, I think it's more about letting Zaydrius get comfortable like Damon did towards the end of last season so that he runs into 26 with a full head of steam versus, hey, we're going to kind of, sprinkle you in here, because Zaydrius has shown in pretty much all the snaps he's played this season, he's ready to play now. Like, he is able to pick up the defensive playbook quickly. I think that's something Ryan Walters has also pointed out. And that says a lot because Ryan Walters does play freshman, but it's not a guarantee.
So, and one of the big things that I think goes along with that is we've been talking about Zaydrius as a guy who was probably going to be one of those guys who played no matter what as a freshman the second he committed. But then, unfortunately, he suffered the torn ACL. And I don't think we'd be even having this part of the discussion if he didn't get hurt in high school. And it's unfortunate that happens, and it is what it is. You obviously can't go back and change that or anything. But I think that's another thing that this coaching staff is considering, where I don't even think it's necessarily as big of a worry if he, has played in 8 games instead of just 3. Like, I think that certainly does play a factor in this as well, because all of a sudden it's, hey, yeah, you have an opportunity now to make a playoff push and you're starting freshmen all over the field or having freshmen play in significant roles all over the field. And there are going to be people who are concerned by that. And I think, there's a level where that's completely understandable. But again, like we were saying before we get out of here, we have been talking about Zaydrius as a guy who could contribute, not just from a physical standpoint, but from a mental standpoint and how he can impact the game, how well he's taken to the defense, as you were saying, and just what kind of energy he brings to the field from anybody who else you've talked to on this defense about Zaydrius. It's, yeah, that guy is one of those dudes who brings the juice on every single rep. And you've seen it at practice. You see it before the games. Like, he's clearly one of those players who just has future leader written all over him, which again is a very exciting thought. And again, if he had played in all 8 games instead of just 3, I don't even think this is a concern. I think it's, oh yeah, no, that guy looks, like Kamori House did last season and is on pace to be a freshman All-American, things like that, because that's the level of talent that just shines through every time Zaydrius is on the field. And it's just a curious thing to think about as this NCAA fiasco continues, because that's really what it is. But Lars, that's all we got for today. As always, thank you so much for being here. Thank all every day for tuning in. We really do appreciate your support. We got so much more fun stuff coming for you throughout the season. So please make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcast, whether that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. We're updating this channel with new content every single day. So please make sure you click that like button, click that little bell so you don't miss when we post a new show. Plus, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, drop them right down below in the comment section. And if you're audio only, please leave us a 5-star review, as it does help us out a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you on Wednesday.